Join you, or it's
Oh, no. You're quite welcome. I think Andy's sitting over there.
Well, hello everybody, and thank you so much for coming. This is really gratifying to see so many of you out. I think you all know me, and you all know that I wrote a book that was published last year called Swimming to the Top of the Tide. It was about swimming the creeks and channels of the Essex River Basin, and how, with my wonderful husband, and how immersing ourselves in that environment was just this wonderful way of becoming more aware of of it as an environment per se, but also of why it's important and what dangers it faces. So now I'm at work on another book because, hey, why not? And it's called, the working title, which I think will become the real title, is Watershed. So as the title implies, it's about high places that receive water, that shed water, and low places that receive it. In other words, the whole earthly hydraulic system that everybody, all of us, are completely dependent upon. No matter where you are in the world, you're part of a watershed. So, one of the best definitions of a watershed that I found comes from the late Peter Warshall. He's was a biologist who is the science editor of the Whole Earth Catalog and the Co-Evolution Quarterly back in the 70s. And I'm really dating myself here, but this is the pre-internet internet. And so here's his definition. A watershed is a gatherer, a living place that draws the sun and the rain together. Its surface of soils, rocks, and plant life acts as a commons for this intermingling. For humans, the watershed is an aquatic contract that has no escape clause. From the forested headlands to the agricultural midstream valleys to the commercial and industrial centers at the river's mouth, good and bad news travels by way of the river, by way of water. Did my city's need for water drain off a river and close off the farmland that gave me fresh vegetables? Did a toxic waste dump leak into the groundwater table and poison people in the next county? Watershed consciousness is in part a promotional campaign to advertise the mutual concerns and needs that bind upstream and downstream, and the journey is right out your window, among the hills and valleys that surround you. So I'm going to read the preface and just the first part of the first chapter. I actually had to look up the difference between a foreword, a preface, and an introduction, because I didn't quite know who I know. But a preface, my understanding of preface is a mini narrative that kind of sketches out the territory that you'll be covering and gives the motivations for writing the book. So, without further ado, preface. My husband, Robert, has had the same message on his phone's answering machine since the early 2000s. Oops. It goes like this. Hi, it's me, but I guess I'm not here. Well, I'm here now, but I'm not here when you're calling. So I'll have to call you back. Leave a message. There are many nows in a life, and therefore many nows in a book. This book is a sequel to Swimming to the Top of the Tide. I've already told you that. It ended in May of 2020, just as the COVID-19 pandemic was ramping up. The resulting social isolation, along with being early retirees, meant that we spent a lot of time at home in the 2 years since. Not just our house, of course, but outdoors, exploring the Essex River watershed, where salt marshes flat as Kansas meet up with craggy, glacier-formed granite hills. At this writing, this now, it is midwinter of 2022. Our newest grandchild, Jake, entered the world in December of 2020, just as the COVID infection and death rate were spiking, a month before the first vaccines became available. His parents, worried about their firstborn not seeing enough of people's faces, worried that he might miss out on some key part of becoming human. But a year later, he's doing the human thing just fine, recapitulating in his own tiny, busy life the evolution of the species. Because his arms no longer have to function as forelegs, he's free to roam about, practicing what hands can do, especially when they're wielding a tool of some sort. He's also picking up the basics of human culture, giving and receiving love, sharing food and other resources. The last plague of this magnitude, the influenza plague of 1918, started 3 years before my father was born, 100 years ago last November. At 68, I'm finding that a century has an increasingly personal scale. Even the 246 some years of American democracy is just the equivalent of 3 82-year lifespans. Picture a current 82-year-old held as a newborn by her grandmother, who was, let's say, born in 1858. Picture that grandmother and her grandmother, who might have been born in 1776, which brings us back to when the ink was barely dry on the Declaration of Independence. Jake and his cousins, on the other hand, are likely to live into the 22nd century. Their grandchildren may get within shouting distance of the 23rd. They are my link to a future, a now, that I will not live to see and find hard to imagine. I dedicated my first book to our children and grandchildren. This book is my love letter to our grandchildren and their children, who will have to deal as best they can with the times and the state of the planet that will be dealt to them. Okay, and this is the first little bit of chapter 1. It's called Great Ledge, West Gloucester. A crack of thunder jolts me out of sleep into a room lit blue. Rain strikes the skylight in sheets. My husband's half of the bed is empty but still warm. I hear his footfalls on the 20 stairs from our bedroom to the first floor. The front door slams. I head down after him, pausing under the shelter of the patio's translucent corrugated roof. Another flash, nearly in sync with the thunder, exposes the semicircle of pines uphill of the patio and the floodwaters surging down from the granite hills above the pines. Robert is a blurry, hunched-over figure in muck boots, rain slicker, and broad-brimmed hat. He's the lone human actor in this arena. He's shoveling gravel into a low barrier across the top of the driveway, trying to set up a channel to convince the floodwaters to go west, not north. West is our patch of woods with its spongy ground cover of moss and leaf field. North, on the other hand, is our crushed stone driveway, laid down just a few weeks ago in 4 successively finer layers of gravel. With time and a temperate rainfall or two, this type of country driveway will settle into a tightly packed, durable surface. But torrential rain takes the shortest, steepest route downhill. It breaches Robert's makeshift levee, dislodges loose stone, and sends it tumbling. A chain reaction of bigger dislodgings and deeper channels until the contest between man and nature is over, and there's nothing left for man to do but drop the shovel and sprint back inside. The next morning, under a clearing sky, pine boughs hold water droplets. Steam rises from damp ground. Coffee cups in hand, we breathe in the smell of wet rock and soggy vegetation. Walking alongside the mini gorge, it's about 8 inches wide and a foot deep, now cutting a jagged path down the driveway. The canyon walls expose sedimentary layers of driveway stone, the bedrock layer of 2 to 4 inch stone, the 1 inch pack, that's stone dust mixed with smaller stone, then the fine top layer of half-inch pack. Water trickles down the miniature river's braids and bow bends. Really, the main difference between the Grand Canyon and this canyon in our driveway is scale. The Colorado River begins as snowmelt in the thousands of peaks in the Rocky Mountains. It travels 1,450 miles and through 7 U.S. states and 2 Mexican states, cutting through dozens of layers of sedimentary rock on its way to the Gulf of Mexico. Here we have the same basic thing in miniature, 10 million years of erosion packed into a 20-minute summer storm. The driveway is about 40 feet long. It curves around the east side of the house, an 8-foot elevation drop from front door to cellar door. After this point, the driveway flattens out. The gorge flattens out too into swirly alluvial fans. The storm water trickles into what our Conservation Commission defines as a buffer zone between the uplands where our house sits and about an acre of wetlands. This parcel of land on record as ours at the Salem Registry of Deeds is its own small watershed. It has high places receiving and shedding water in the original sense of the word as a dividing line, like the ridge of a roof. The lower part of the land is a watershed in its second sense, a level plain where water from high places sheds too. It's not obvious from the ground, but all of this earthy dampness holds the remote ends of Walker and Lumpkin creeks, 2 of the 5 creeks that merge into the Essex River, which in turn flows between the tips of 2 barrier beaches into the Ipswich Bay, and from there out into the Atlantic Ocean. Zoom out and it's like nesting dolls. The Essex River Basin is enclosed within the Ipswich Bay. The Ipswich Bay is swallowed up in a crescent of coast that stretches from Gloucester to Newburyport. By the time you get to the Gulf of Maine, our watershed is just a notch and jut in the coastline, and our hills are absorbed into a vast coastal plain dwarfed by the northern spine of the Appalachian Mountains. That storm happened 5 years ago. The driveway has long since been repaired. 4 separate drains installed below ground direct rainwater to places other than the driveway. It's winter now, and we stand in the same spot at the base of the driveway in cold weather bushwhacking attire. Waterproof boots and gaiters, heavy jackets and snow pants, serious hats and gloves. Each of us holds a single ski pole. And that's as far as I've gotten in sort of hacking through the wilderness of my rough draft, which is kind of still in the word salad phase. I'm going to tell you I'm just going to off the cuff tell you where we went from there. Okay, so how many of you are familiar with the Great Ledge Reservation? I know, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I'm going to say here that one of the great things about snow is that you can see things that aren't normally visible. You can see the contours of the land. Also, if it's cold enough, you can walk on it. So you can walk on these little waterways that normally would be, squishy, and you'd be, up to your knees in mud. So that was what we were doing that day, is setting out on a walk through these sort of winding rivulets, I guess, which eventually flow over towards a stone wall, sort of the edge of the property. And then from there, it becomes kind of a woodland stream in this wonderful valley, again, which you can see very well in the snow, of mostly just beech and oak. To our left, if we're heading towards Walker Creek, is a farm and hay fields, and to our right is the absolutely spectacular Great Ledge, this rise of granite to the north, which is very sheer in places. So we're walking along the Great Ledge, and the creek is kind of right here. The water, the wetland is right here, and then the snow is kind of, going up. So we had to, how would you describe that? Sort of, walking on the snow, sort of walk sideways to sort of create an edge. to walk against, but it's the Great Ledge. It's maybe 80, possibly 100 feet up, and it's absolutely, awesome in the older sense of that word. So there we were, and if you happen to have Facebook and your phone, feel free. I posted some photos of the places that we're walking. So there's some of the Great Ledge and at the swamp and so on and so forth. So with our ski poles and in a place where it's not so sheer, towards the end, towards Walker Creek, we kind of sort of scrambled up, which at my age is quite a challenge. Again, you're keeping your center of gravity low and climbing around boulders, and then you finally come up around the top, and it's somewhat of a plateau for a while, and then gradually slopes down to what we tend to think of as Meg and Bruce Herman's backyard. So we're, again, that interconnected thing. Oh yeah, because this is after a storm, there's a lot of tree fall. Is everybody familiar with that expression? It's what you get left over when a tree falls over, and it's the root ball that's exposed, and it just sort of shows everything that tree has been clinging to. So look at tree falls and think about that, and ruminate on, the nature of time. And Meg,
just because the trees have very little topsoil, they're growing on the ledge. The roots are all shallow and wide.
Yes, and you know exactly which one I'm talking about. Yes. Basically, it's a very thin sheet of like pine needles, basically, in these trees up on the ledge. Anyway, so we're enjoying the tree fall and meditating upon, life and the time scale of things. The granite hills are on one time frame. The trees are on a shorter time frame, but still pretty impressive and massive. And then we end up full circle back at the wetlands where we started out. So, and then at some point, one of us says or notices that we've been here since 1979. We've owned this land since 1979, and obviously we were a whole lot younger then, but almost all of the trees in this wetland, and I think, elsewhere as well, almost all of them are younger than we are. And the trees that were first there when we showed up as 24-year-olds to build our first house, they're gone. They've fallen over. We cut some of them down, to make our house, but so pretty amazing thing. So our property is about 3 acres. The Great Ledge is, I think, like 11 or 12 acres.
Oh, I think it's, I think it's 8 acres.
Yeah. So we've got this tiny watershed. The Great Ledge is a slightly bigger watershed. And then that watershed is part of, I would say, about 3.5 square miles of watershed, bigger peaks and so on that drain into the Essex River. And
so there's the Mass Electric land that attaches
yes,
to the
yeah. So I'm just setting out on this book, but I wanted to just briefly tell you where it's headed. I see 3 main sections, and the first is source, the high places. So we're going to be talking about the high places in Cape Ann, elsewhere, and because we're metaphor-making creatures and storytelling creatures, I'll be thinking also about the metaphorical meaning of watersheds. Second section will be commons, which is watershed in the second sense. It's the aquatic commons where all that water from high places flows to, which we share. And then the third section would be crucible, which is considering watershed in its metaphorical sense. And interestingly, as I was working on this, I tend to think of a watershed moment as that tipping point when something goes one way or the other. A critical spot situation goes one way or the other and it's irrevocable. But more and more I've seen that metaphor arising as well from the commons, from the lowlands, the tragedy of the commons and that sort of thing. So Anyway. Then as a Christ follower, I'm motivated by wanting to think about what it means to serve the common good. And I guess this book is a way of doing that. I can be very ethereal about what the faith means, about what discipleship means, and I suspect that I'm not alone. But I find this wonderful practical presence in the Old Testament prophets and the Gospels. You see it with John the Baptist right off the bat. So as soon as he's addressed people as a brood of vipers and said, the axe is at the tree ready to chop, and they say, well, what shall we do? And what does he say? He says, whoever has 2 coats must share with anyone who has none, and whoever has food must do likewise. And then in this passage from Ezekiel, we've got God speaking as the Good Shepherd, of course pointing forward to Jesus as the Good Shepherd, judging those who are not thinking about the common good. They're only thinking about me and mine and what's good for me. So just a brief passage from that. I will bring them out from the nations and gather them from the countries. I will bring them into their own land. I will pasture them on the mountains of Israel, in the ravines, and in all the settlements in the land. Is it not enough for you to feed on the good pasture? Must you also trample the rest of your pasture with your feet? Is it not enough for you to drink clear water? Must you also muddy the rest with your feet? Must my flock feed on what you have trampled and drink what you have muddied with your feet? Therefore, this is what the sovereign Lord says to them. See, I myself will judge between the fat sheep and the lean sheep, because you shove with flank and shoulder, butting all the weak sheep with your horns until you have driven them away. I will save my flock, and they will no longer be plundered. I will bless them in the places surrounding my hill. I will send down showers in season. There will be showers of blessing. The trees of the field will yield their fruit and the ground will yield its crops. The people will be secure in their land. They will know that I am the Lord when I break the bars of their yoke and rescue them from the hands of those who enslave them. So that's what I have, and I would love to open it up to questions, comments, critiques, whatever you've got. So, Bill.
Patty, I'm so grateful for your sharing this with us and being vulnerable in this moment. I know how hard that is, and I'm honored that I'm a part of this group that is in that intimate process. I want to say first how moving I find what you've already written, and how excited I am about the process and what it will lead to. And I'm especially grateful for the multiple meanings of the word watershed, both as a noun and as an adjective. Mm-hmm. And if I'm not mistaken, as you map the arc of the book, and I'm saying, sort of thinking out loud here to test whether this is correct, it sounds like in addition to calling us to look more carefully at place, you're also calling us to understand more deeply time and the power of now. That often we understand in hindsight, for lack of a better word, hindsight, that a moment was a watershed moment. Mm-hmm. And yet, if we live more deeply into the present, we can perhaps grasp the nature of more watershed moments and the possibility that the present affords us to enter more deeply into the choices, and into perhaps callings that we have shut off in our determination to meet the future as we, in our fallenness, determine that to be, as compared to what God is calling us into. So if I'm not mistaken, that is a part of what you are charting through this arc, that there are multiple meanings to Watershed, and one of them is time and the adjective, if I'm hearing you right. And I hope I am, because I think it's wonderful.
Bill, it sounds great. Yeah, I mean, that does sound like it.
I'm not trying to be your literary agent. I recommend others for that, but I am trying to commend you and to thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Bill, for those comments. And as a fellow writer, you know all about the journey, the terror of the blank page, and all of that stuff. Thank you, Jack.
This is great, great stuff. It's so evocative and spiritual and theological all at the same time. We're hearing a lot today about the theme of interconnectivity, that we're all interconnected and with nature and so forth. So I just wonder if what you're doing here, if that is sort of a thread through your thinking and imagination, how we are connected. And then the other thing is that it's obvious that you and Bob have been very familiar with the local place, but it sounds like you had at some point an epiphany to see that in a new way. Was there a moment when you sort of had that aha moment, seeing this terrain in a new way, or I don't know if that makes any sense?
Oh, thank you for that question. Yeah, I would say it's been a slow process of aha moments, perhaps over the last 20 years or so, as I've gone from a kind of a late young adult to an elder now. I feel very acutely, maybe because we're getting older and you realize that we won't be here forever. Trying to think of, I've definitely had epiphanies that have driven home to me how my fate, if you will, is tied up with everyone else's fate. That we cannot get away from that, and I really believe that we can't love God if we're not acutely aware of His entire creation and the entire worldwide people that He's put on this earth. Does that?
Yeah, right. And your image of the tree fall really grabbed me, because I like to walk around Koi Pond and especially appreciate just sometimes just looking at fungus or looking at a rotten log and having that sense that life is short. Someday I'm going to die, and that's just part of the story, and just to appreciate it.
Yeah. I mean, it becomes more precious. All of these things, and certainly lichen and fungus, that figures into this book, because it's so much a part of the whole ecosystem, and so beautiful, so practical, and so on. Jeremy.
You mentioned, but thank you so much for this. This is beautiful to hear.
Would you mind just pulling your mask for a second?
Thank you so much for this. It's beautiful to hear the beginnings of this. You hinted in the preface about scale and the comparison between what you saw in your driveway to the Grand Canyon. Watershed has so many different implications on a global scale in different regions. And I'm wondering if you thought about how you're going to take the local experiences that you're seeing and expand upon that to a global scale, if at all. Are there specific examples that you're thinking of trying to relate to, or are you really trying to keep it much more on a smaller scale?
I would say both and, that we always, throughout the book, we keep coming back to to the Great Ledge, this little watershed, but I'll be all over the place. Even on Cape Ann, I think that I can count on maybe one hand the peaks that are over 200 feet, or maybe hovering right around there. So we climbed up all of those, and from there I'm heading up to Mount Washington, where I once had sort of a mountaintop experience, but I actually grew up in Southern California. So I went back out there this past fall, and that will be a big part of the book, because I was born in 1954. The swimming book mentions this, that born right, just post-World War, but right as what we call now the Great Acceleration was beginning. And so I'm not personally responsible for every decision that was made that's kind of made a mess of things, but I own it. So on an individual level, I will go out to California, we'll visit some landmarks, and there will be other places as well. But does that answer? Okay. Bruce?
I love your structure of Highlands, Commons, and Crucible, and I kind of get the first two a little bit better, but I wonder if you could speak about the Crucible.
Yeah. The Crucible. I see that in both, as a Christian, I see that we've always, we're in a crucible now because we're not thinking about the common good. But I've also done a fair amount of layman's study on the evolution of the human species, and I actually have E.O. Wilson is a biologist who has talked.
He's just died.
He did die. Okay, pardon me. Yeah, but he talks about how we became human by learning to use tools. And with tools comes, all sorts of good things and bad things. We build things, but we break things, and we hurt people with our tools. But embedded within that as well, at the beginning of our life as actual genetically modern humans, was the altruism thing. We could not have become human, could not have developed human culture without sharing food, and that act of sharing food was part of what allowed us to evolve into who we are now. So I'm just going to search for this. He has a wonderful line, Wilson. What biology seems to be doing at the moment is to reveal the roots of ambiguity that define human nature. We've been talking, for example, about the eternal confliction of the human mind between self-serving behavior for the individual and for its offspring versus service to the group. This clash of evolutionary forces can never result in an equilibrium. If it goes too far toward individualism, societies would dissolve. If, on the other hand, it goes too far towards obedience to the group would turn into an ant colony. So we're creatively conflicted, moving back and forth between sin and virtue, rebellion and loyalty, love and hate. And he says earlier in this, on the other hand, we dream together, and as a result, the cultural products of human nature are vastly expanded and enriched. Bruce, does that help?
So just to follow up quickly, so
Yeah.
the Crucible is the interaction of human and the natural watershed process? Is that kind of how you're thinking about it?
Kind of, yeah, or at least that it's a metaphor. That when we see these natural forces, the nature of the watershed, which is a commons and requires all of us to cooperate, and of course we don't. It's easy to project from that. In fact, humans have projected from that because we have these metaphors about about crucibles, about watershed moments, and so
It's
on.
kind of a trick of language that we say culture and nature as though they're separate,
Yeah,
but they're actually, we're part of nature.
exactly. Yeah, and technology, of course, is part of nature, if you think about it. Yeah. Liz?
Something I really loved and appreciated about the first book that I feel like is also resonating with me about your new reading is I feel like you have made an intentional choice at a certain point to slow your pace so that you could do the beautiful work of noticing what's around you and describing it and getting to know it. And you know, something we know about you and Robert is that you're also both visual artists, and I'm wondering, do you see a connection? Because it's incredibly countercultural right now to do anything not, you know, a mile a minute. And I think, you know, even my physical experience of reading your first book, I felt sort of physical, like, antsiness of like, what's gonna happen? You know, just thinking like it's so different for you to model, and I feel like you know, it's not a book about marriage or your partnership over many years, but it also kind of is. And I feel like you're showing and modeling that you're in it together, and you have this visual artist piece, and you have slowed down certain extents so that you can notice all this like beauty and destruction, you know, everything that's happening around you. And I don't have a question, I guess, but
Yeah.
I'm sort of curious if you've noticed that around like pace and also like creativity and visual art coming into it as well.
Oh, yeah, they're definitely interconnected because a lot of my way of apprehending the landscape is visual. Robert definitely is a visual person too. He is much more I'm more likely to notice the surfaces, the textures, and the colors and things. He is always looking for signs of human presence. Of what does this stone wall mean here? The stone wall that starts, or this double stone wall, the stone wall that disappears. Oh, look at this slab of rock over here. They used to quarry here, and we can see that. You can see where they kind of stopped. This is at the base of the Great Ledge. There are actual quarry marks, you know, primitive quarry marks on some of the rocks that have been left behind. As to pacing, I'm just the most neurotic person in the world, and it's very hard for me to slow down. So this is, I would say, somewhat of a spiritual practice to get out most days. Sometimes Robert has to drag me out because I've got to get things done. But when you get out there, you slow down. And we tend to bushwhack, which is, again, this gets into the partnership thing. It's something that I could not do by myself, because if you fall, who's gonna come pick you up if you're out in the middle of the West Gloucester, you know, woods. So bushwhacking has become a way to slow down. You can take a very vigorous walk. You know, sometimes we're stomping over brambles and things, and you haven't actually gone that far. But bushwhacking is a way of making this small place huge. There's just more and more to discover there. Dean.
I'm struck by the word that you use, describing, okay, I'm born in '54, the era of acceleration. I don't have anything to do with that, except own it. You use that word, own. And what triggered off in my mind is
Which word?
own, O-W-N.
Oh, yeah.
I need to own that going forward,
Yeah.
even though you weren't alive in '53.
Well, Robert was, and I came along. Yeah. Well, we kind of rode this. There was this incredible swell of prosperity and and progress and so on. We rode that wave. We rode that because we were born into I guess upper middle class homes. We rode that wave of prosperity. We benefited from it. So we own that, even though.
Well, we inherited it.
We inherited it.
When our parents passed away, so.
Yeah.
But what
maybe
triggered
better.
off for me with that is that word progress. And then I had a flashback. Jane and I were in India in '90 on the Habitat for Humanity project. We had an opportunity to go up to Agra and then to the Ganges. And our guide very discreetly said, this is the most polluted river in the world.
Mhm.
And I was struck that he was so candid.
Mhm.
And I got off to the side and had just a bit of a conversation with him about that. And he recommended that I get an author. And so when I got back, I read, and it was a hydrologist who came from the headwaters of the Ganges. And so now I'm getting a picture
Oh.
of the headwaters and what I saw in Agra. And they don't mix at all.
Yeah.
And this man has been on a crusade.
Mm.
Essentially, we clean up the river. He says, we need to own that.
Mhm.
And then I hear you use that same word. And I said,
Yeah.
yikes, where are the people in India? That river is still,
Yeah.
and the headwaters are still pristine. What in the world?
Yeah. That's crazy.
So how do you solve that?
How do you solve that? That's up to Liz and her her
I'm gonna
cohort.
just add to that, the Ipswich River watershed was just named one of the top 10 most endangered
Yeah.
watersheds in the
Yeah.
entire United States. And I
Yes.
think-
Yeah.
Yes, and we think of, I think ourselves on the North Shore as like excellent caretakers and stewards, but that's actually not the case. And our overuse and the way we use is like really at risk. And Essex and Gloucester and Ipswich really are all connected. And I think that, so.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for that, Liz. I was really surprised to find that out.
Right, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Phil.
If you'll forgive my mentioning this, connected to what Liz has just said, there is a much lesser known stream, Sawmill Brook, which is recognized as an especially valuable water resource because of the fish life in it.
Which town is this in?
In Manchester.
Okay. Yeah.
And it is also at a watershed moment because there is a plan to effectively destroy it through leveling Shingle Hill, which is the tallest place in Manchester, and put a big multifamily luxury housing development on top of it. And so awareness of these threats is a part of the stewardship to which God calls us. And when we learn about what has happened with the Ipswich River, we can perhaps make changes to prevent degradation that might otherwise occur were we to remain in ignorance of the damage that's already occurred.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I didn't know that. We're somewhat familiar with Sawmill Brook because we kind of followed the various feeders for Walker Creek and those that flow towards Manchester Harbor. I just want to interject another thing that another reason for Christians to care about watersheds is that environmental degradation, it affects us all, but it disproportionately affects the poor. Because they depend more directly upon, the resources of watersheds than those of us who are more affluent. We can, insulate ourselves somewhat, but yeah.
Well, one of the issues about the Ipswich River is where the water is pulled off from upstream to feed other people in,
Yeah.
in places that are downstream or, not coming all the way down. So you get, with these things, the question is, who is going to benefit and who is not going to benefit?
Yeah.
And the whole, you can't say so-and-so is going to be more valuable or less valuable by getting it.
Yeah, it's
So
a dilemma.
You're
Yeah.
robbing one to benefit a different one.
Mhm. Yeah, I think having grown up post-war, there was this sense that these resources are limitless. That there's plenty of water out there, plenty of land, plenty of fish, plenty of everything. And so a lot of things that were built, whether they're diversions to rivers or power plants and so on, we weren't able to see the consequences, or maybe some people might have been able to see them, but their voices weren't loud enough. Just a quick mention here. I grew up in Ventura County, California, and only found out fairly recently that we were 18 miles from the worst nuclear disaster in the country's history. And that was from the former Boeing laboratory, which is in the hills between Simi Valley and the Pacific Ocean. So we were 18 miles away. Horrible meltdown. It happened in 1959, the year I went to kindergarten, and nobody knew about it because it was a government, that people are, there are cancer clusters and all sorts of things. But again, this optimism about what we can do. It was for testing rockets. It was the Boeing Rocketdyne site. So we're left with the consequences. Yes.
I tend to think, I just spent more of my time thinking about the watershed on the state level, so I just wanted to comment a little bit about that. Because I think we have a very unique situation in Massachusetts and human intervention in it. It's a very unique situation where we, for about half the population of our state that's served by the Massachusetts Water Resource Authority, all that water, drinking water, comes from the western part of the state,
Yes.
about 100 miles west.
Mm-hmm.
And so we are every day transferring massive amounts of water from the western part of the state, about 100 miles west, and these huge aqueducts going to the eastern part of the state. It's on I believe, and then it ends up in the Deer Island Treatment Facility, which is, it's a massive, it was the third largest public works project in the world when you put that in.
Wow.
It's a massive system, and what goes out then to the ocean is on the order of 300 million gallons a day. And it's just the scale of this is something to think about.
Yeah.
I mean, what's amazing is that the environment is delicate but also robust, and so luckily I feel like there are smart, good people monitoring this major human intervention, but it so far seems to be handling it pretty well.
Yeah.
Back when the source of this water in the Western Mass was it was 3 towns that they flooded to create the Quabbin Reservoir.
Yeah.
And
Enfield was one of the towns.
yes, correct.
Yeah.
Is no more.
Yeah. So I just want to comment on that because just thinking about that as you're talking about the watershed on the local side.
Yeah, I think you bring up all kinds of great points. One of them is that we're not heading. We have to work with what we've got. We're not going back to the garden. We're heading towards the city. So we have to sort of figure out and manage what we've done. Yeah. So kind of after the fact.
Just go back to Liz's question for a minute. I mean, the Ipswich, one of the lowest 10 overuse and pollution. Can you just quickly, what are the major sources of pollution for the Ipswich River currently?
I don't know the answer to that. But we have a great local organization, Ipswich River Watershed Association, and they are a super resource, and they track and monitor all of these things. I think in general, water pollution is coming from like lawn chemicals, agriculture, and industry. But I don't know specifically here in New England and here in Ipswich, like which of those is really the driver. But I think it's a combo of pollution and then drawing too much. And we have to Bruce's point, an unequitable distribution of resources, and some cities and towns have remediation or are paying for the water and others don't because of sort of old clauses and who has power and wealth. So there's like a real sort of power and political discussion as well, of course.
Well, also part of it is slow flow. You know, it's
And climate change.
climate.
Yeah.
Well, I guess I'll let you head off to church and grab your coffee, and I've really gotten a whole lot from your comments and really appreciate you coming out and engaging so thoughtfully. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Patty.